So I recently released a video that detailed the level of Jewish overrepresentation on Joe Rogan's podcast. As it turns out, about 42% of all political guests and 22% of guests overall are ethnically Jewish. This despite Jews making up only 2% of the US population. And I wonder how Joe Rogan has been doing since then. Better than average. Now, while many commenters on that video agreed that this state of affairs was concerning, and for reasons which extend far beyond the Joe Rogan experience, a strong minority of commenters tried to rationalize this overrepresentation, to explain it away not as the result of foul play or preferential treatment, but as something completely natural and expected. Their most common argument, of course, centered around the Jews' supposedly higher average IQ as compared to every other ethnic group in the US. Because the Jews are so much more intelligent, the argument goes, we should expect them, and indeed want them, to be overrepresented in positions of power, influence, and prestige. You've probably heard this argument in one form or another, perhaps even on Joe Rogan's podcast.
So here's another example. Ashkenazi Jews have an average IQ of 115. So in the typical population overall has an average IQ of 100. Well, let's go look at people who only have an IQ of 145, which is kind of where you hit the beginnings of genius level. It's like the Jews are overwhelmingly overrepresented.
The basic form of the argument is as so. Ashkenazi Jews, the largest ethnic subgroup of Jews in the US, has an average IQ of anywhere from 107 to 115, depending on which study is being cited, with whites sitting around 100. The fact that their average IQ is so much higher, combined with the nature of normal distribution, means that even though Jews represent just a tiny fraction of the US population, we should expect them to represent a significant portion or even the majority of geniuses in the US. And if you take just a quick look at it, it seems like it could be true. With just some basic math, we can figure out that with a normal distribution on IQ scores and with a standard deviation of 15, we would expect to see 302,000 white Americans with an IQ at or above 145, while we would expect to see about 173,000 Jewish Americans with an IQ at or above 145. So despite whites outnumbering Jews 26 to 1 in America, we would expect the number of Jewish geniuses to be not that far off from the number of white geniuses. And of course, smarter people are going to tend to outperform others, hence Jewish overrepresentation. So then if the claims of higher than average Jewish IQ are true, this whole thing seems plausible. But are those claims true? Where exactly do these claims come from? What allows Jordan Peterson to talk so confidently on the matter?
Why are Jews so goddamn smart?
This video will simply be about the sober unearthing and examining of all evidence which has been used to support the idea of a higher average Jewish IQ. By the end, I intend to leave no doubt in anyone's mind as to the utter falseness of this narrative. I will begin by examining the scientific studies on the matter. Second, I will break down the various arguments which explain the supposed origin of their high IQ. And lastly, I will examine the subtle details of the form of the argument itself, which seems to be riddled with non sequiturs and just nonsense that most people seem to miss. This video is intended as an introduction to all of the most commonly cited works and arguments surrounding this fairly far-reaching debate. As such, feel free to use the chapter markers in the video to skip around. Like I said, let's start by looking at the scientific literature. Now, in total, there exist several dozen studies which deal with our topic in at least some way, most of which, however, are of a lower quality and as such are rarely cited or discussed. So I will be skipping over these studies for the sake of brevity. In total, I will be examining the 6 studies which I found to be the most commonly cited and discussed around the matter, as these will no doubt have played the largest role in propagating this idea to the masses. The first study is written by Backman, published in 1972, and it's titled Patterns of Mental Abilities, Ethnic, Socioeconomic, and Sex Differences. Now, this study is perhaps the most commonly cited paper on the matter. It showed up in at least half of the articles and papers that I read. In the study, Backman examined results from intelligence tests of 2,925 U.S. high school students, including 1,236 Ashkenazis. The results are as follows. You can see there are 6 categories in which the students were tested, and this is typical of intelligence testing, as the goal is to form a comprehensive picture of an individual. You can see that overall, the Jewish students performed okay, with good scores in the verbal and mathematics categories, but with poor scores in the visuospatial and reasoning categories. So while this study may suggest a higher than average verbal IQ for Jews, it does nothing to suggest a higher general intelligence or a higher overall IQ score for Jews. If you were to average the scores of all the tests together, Jewish students achieve a score of 51.88, while white students averaged a 51.22. Again, this is easily one of the 4 most cited papers on the matter, and it does nothing to suggest a serious difference in general intelligence between whites and Jews. The next study we'll be looking at is by Levinson from 1957, titled The Intelligence of Applicants for Admission to Jewish Day Schools. The study involved 5,494 Jewish kindergarten applicants aged 4 to 7 years old, administered the Stanford Binet intelligence test. The study argues for an average IQ of 118, but in my opinion, there is a major problem with the methodology. First off, the selected students were chosen from only private paid day schools in New York. The students from 16 schools were used in the test. 5 schools had been dropped for using a different type of test altogether, and then 5 more area schools were added by the author. Why he chose to add these schools and presumably exclude many others is not stated. Now, this alone doesn't do anything to say that this study is bad. The problem I have with it is that everywhere I saw this paper cited, it was being used to support the idea of a higher than average IQ for all Ashkenazi Jews, when in reality the study only dealt with an extremely limited set of gifted kindergartners, most of whom probably had very involved parents. Also, the study gives no comparison of these Jewish students to a comparable cohort of white students, only to all non-Jews, which of course includes children of all races, almost all of whom would not have been accepted into private kindergartens. So in short, to suggest that this study is in any way representative of all Jews is absolutely absurd. This next study comes from Richard Lynn in 2003, and it's titled The Intelligence of American Jews. The study argues for a verbal IQ of 107.8. Now, the paper starts off by pointing out that although people generally agree on the idea of high Jewish verbal intelligence, many studies have shown Jews to have verbal IQs just 1 or 2 points above or even below whites. He then writes briefly about the Backman study mentioned above, and converts the test scores from that study into estimated IQ scores. And there's a few interesting things to note here. Number 1, if we average all of those Jewish IQ scores together, we get 100.87. Number 2, while we're bringing the Backman study back up, it's unclear whether in that study the white category included Hispanics. Since there was no separate category for Hispanics given in that study, we can assume that perhaps they were included in the white cohort. And if this was the case, we would expect the white IQ to have been skewed slightly downwards, as historically, Hispanics have scored worse on IQ tests. And third, even if the white category does not include Hispanics, there are still some potential problems, namely that white includes all people of European descent. It's only when you include every country in Europe, including many Eastern European countries who tend to score lower on IQ tests, that you get an average IQ for Europe of 100. If you were to look at only Western European countries and average their IQ scores, the score would be above 100. On the flip side, if we were to do the same averaging for the Jews, we would have to include, along with the Ashkenazis, the Sephardics and the Mizrahi, both of which would severely reduce the average IQ score for all Jews. And this is a relevant point because although it's true that there are very few Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews in the US, it's also the case that most white Americans are descended from Western Europeans. So assuming for them the average pan-European IQ of 100 is probably assuming a far too low estimate. But everything above is just from the start of the paper. The actual study itself involved a small but supposedly representative nationwide vocabulary test. And these are the results. Note again that non-Jewish whites are grouped together, which means it is unclear again if this group includes people of Hispanic admixture, and assuredly includes non-Nordics. So we have another study which suggests a verbal IQ about a half standard deviation higher than the supposed white IQ of 100. Their low visuospatial and memory scores, however, offset their verbal IQ to give an average IQ of right around 100. The pan-European average, or perhaps a good deal lower than most Western European countries. So next up, I figured I would be remiss if I didn't mention the work done by Kevin MacDonald on the subject, the author of the much reviled The Culture of Critique. Surprisingly, his claims are used very often in the support of the high IQ Jewish argument, despite the fact that most of his books and papers have a strong focus on the fact that Jewish overrepresentation cannot be reasonably explained by high IQ alone. Anyways, I'm not going to spend much time on Kevin MacDonald's work anyhow, because he doesn't actually do any novel research in the area. All of his conclusions are based on past research and conjecture. In fact, here is a passage from his book titled A People That Shall Dwell Alone, in which he makes the high IQ claim and cites his sources. You can see that many of these studies have actually already been discussed in this video. The one study by Levinson, which he cites and then goes on to use seemingly as the only source for his conclusion, has already been shown to be non-representative as discussed above. But MacDonald misuses this study in the same way that most who cite it do, by pretending that the population was representative of Jews as a whole. I also want to draw your attention to a point that MacDonald makes here. Although IQ is made up of several scores from different tests of aptitude, such as verbal, mathematics, memory, etc., for all populations, these scores have a strong correlation with each other. In other words, if you're good at math, you're likely to be similarly good in other portions of the IQ test. Ashkenazis seem to be the one exception to this rule, showing a correlation of only 0.31 between their verbal and performance IQs, compared to a correlation of 0.77 in the general population. So I guess I'm not even positive what this means, but I thought it was important to bring up because it serves to highlight that any reported high IQ of Jews is largely being bolstered by their standout performance in this one category of verbal IQ. The next commonly cited source is a book by Miles Storfer from 1990 titled Intelligence and Giftedness. It argues that Ashkenazi IQ is more than a full standard deviation above the norm, so 115 plus. I saw two major problems with this study. Firstly, the study only tested children raised within Jewish communes known as kibbutzes, which place a large emphasis on education and tend to produce, according to Wikipedia, quote, surprisingly large numbers of teachers, lawyers, doctors, and political leaders. Also, according to Wikipedia, in 2010, there were 270 kibbutzes in Israel, with a total population of 126,000, and these numbers haven't varied much throughout time. With such a small population and with such a drastically different lifestyle to that of your average Ashkenazi, the study absolutely cannot be assumed to be representative. Secondly, while the book does indeed take a guess at an IQ of 117 for Ashkenazi Jews, it also cites absurdly high scores for Sephardic Jews, suggesting they range as high as 116.5 for some subgroups, and they average around 111. This despite the fact that we know Sephardics today have an average IQ of around 91. And if the Ashkenazi IQ was off by a similar 20-point margin, then we would expect them to have an average IQ of 104. I think it's also important to note here that the children tested were aged 4 and 5. Now, in theory, we should be able to get a reasonable estimate for adult IQ by testing children. But in practice, there seems to be a lot of variation over time. You see, IQ is measured by comparing your score on a given intelligence test to the median score of all others in your age range. So if you do better than the median, your score is above 100 and vice versa. Now, this part is just my speculation, but at such a young age, when the children know practically nothing about math, a very little amount of education in mathematics will drastically improve your score as compared to the rest of your cohort. In other words, it's a lot less work to go from a 1 to a 2 than it is to go from a 20 to a 40. Even though the magnitude of the change is equivalent. Because of this, it seems reasonable to me that childhood IQ scores would be subject to wild variations based on what the child has or has not been exposed to. And only after several more years would we see these uneven areas average out to more closely resemble that person's actual intelligence. And this is why adult IQ tests are always going to be preferred over childhood ones. I also bring up this problem here because even within this book by Storfer alone, there are several instances of groups doing worse on IQ tests as they age. In the example of the Sephardic scores I just showed, the cohort aged 6 to 11 consistently outscored the cohort aged 12 to 13, suggesting the IQ tests for younger students may have been skewed upwards. And importantly for the overall conversation here, the vast majority of studies which find higher IQ for Jews tend to do so with extremely young age groups. There are surprisingly few studies which study adult Ashkenazi IQ, and most of these are very small or non-representative. And this fact alone is likely playing a large role in the popular promotion of this idea. I think the studies in this book serve as only good examples to remind us that IQ can only be used as a comparative measure. They're only really useful to compare how two people or two populations who took the same test at the same time stack up to each other. These tests do indeed show that Ashkenazi Jews have always scored consistently higher on IQ tests than Sephardics, which is corroborated by many other studies. But because there is no simultaneous study of other groups, we cannot use this to directly compare Jews to non-Jews. And lastly, number 6, I'll make a quick mention here of the bell curve, as many of you will have heard of this book. Now, the authors have a lot to say on the subject of IQ, of course, but they only mention Ashkenazis once, repeating the same estimate of 107 to 115. And here is an image of the citation of this claim, and as you can see, it comes from the book by Miles Storfers that we just discussed above. And that will be all for the studies that I examined in depth in this video. My conclusion at this point in my research was that Ashkenazi Jews have indeed been shown time and time again to score slightly better than average on the verbal portion of IQ tests, while scoring slightly worse than average on the other portions of the test. When all sections of these various tests, however, are averaged together, they tend to score right around 100. The pan-European average. So now let's move on from these studies themselves and look at the reasons that people think Jews might just be so darn smart. And if any of these explanations make sense, then it would make accepting the entire idea a lot easier. Now, the first argument, it seemed to me, was actually the preferred argument of many Jews themselves, who seemed hesitant to accept the idea of any race-based differences in intelligence. They chose to ascribe it entirely to nurture rather than nature, in other words.
Why are Jews so goddamn smart? European Jews.
Our culture, European Jews. Our culture values education hard.
Yeah.
And we're just like, look, we're not great athletes.
They choose to think that the Jews are smarter simply because they have always had an academic lifestyle. They try harder in school, in their jobs, and this is because they're motivated by their family and communities to do so. Now, this is actually the one argument I'll discuss which, of course, could be valid. Of course, it's only potentially valid because it's practically unfalsifiable. I mean, we don't even really have a good way to know how much nurture can affect a person's IQ. And it also brings up an obvious question, namely that Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews share many cultural habits with Ashkenazi Jews. So why are their IQs so low in comparison? So barring this major problem, I would actually say that there could be some validity to this argument. But the question would still remain, is it enough to explain a standard deviation difference in average IQ? But assuming then that the higher than average Jewish IQ is due to genetics, nature rather than nurture, we would expect there to be an explanation for why this is the case. Some sort of evolutionary pressure which caused this change. Now, many do believe in the genetic explanation, and as such, there are many theories as to the cause. Now, first up is the idea which I'll call Talmudic eugenics, or basically the idea that Jews valued intelligence much more than anyone else. According to this argument, because highly educated rabbis were allowed to have children, as opposed to highly educated Christian monks whose intellect died with them, and because the Jews put so much emphasis on ensuring their children were married to intelligent partners, this has had some sort of race-wide eugenic effect on intelligence. The problem, of course, with this claim, as with many of these claims, is that it's practically unfalsifiable. It is impossible to know exactly how much of an effect these cultural practices would have on intelligence. And besides, we also know that there were plenty of other intelligent Europeans who did not go into monastic life, including officers in the army, businessmen, government officials, tradesmen, and artists of all sorts. Even the yeoman who owned his own farm must have been at least of a better than average intelligence. Plus, the better that any of these people did at their jobs, the more children they would have, generally speaking, which produces a universal eugenic effect on intelligence, which the Jews tried to claim for their own. Also, who's to say that the Jews would have always chosen the most intelligent partner for their children? I would assume that, generally speaking, they would choose a well-off partner who can provide for their children and their grandchildren over the penniless scholar. And in the extremely insular community of medieval Jews, practically all wealth could be inherited. So there isn't even necessarily a correlation between intelligence and wealth, as some might want to argue. And lastly, we again know that the Mizrahi and the Sephardic Jews practiced the exact same Talmudic traditions, but they did not seem to benefit from them as the Ashkenazi supposedly did. Now, for another, albeit less frequently used explanation, enter what I'm calling oppression eugenics. It's sometimes argued that Jews were oppressed so hard that they became smart to deal with it. Couple obvious problems. Number one, if oppression breeds intelligence, why is it that the supposedly most oppressed group in the US, African Americans, tends to score so low on IQ tests? Surely by now they should be Wakanda tier if our white oppression did to them what it did for the Jews. And for that matter, what about the Gypsies? But the argument goes, the Ashkenazis' particular brand of oppression forced them into working in areas that honed their mathematical and language skills beyond those of other groups. In the Middle Ages, speaking very broadly, Christians were barred from, or at least severely hampered in lending money, and the Jews were barred from participating in most other jobs. So they naturally became bankers and moneylenders, and these roles honed their numerical and verbal skills, with the most successful moneylenders having the most offspring. This also explains their poor spatial awareness skills, since these wouldn't be needed in the banking industry. But of course, there are big problems with this explanation as well. To start, I want to add as a note of nuance that Christians actually could lend money. They were just severely hampered in doing so by the anti-usury laws. For examples of how they accomplished this in spite of the laws, look into the Italian banking families of the 13th century. Broadly speaking, though, it is true that Jews were the moneylenders, accounting for the broad majority of the people in that field in any given place and time throughout the Middle Ages. Now, the main point here, Jews were not forced into being bankers, except perhaps by the fact that it was the most lucrative job available to them. Generally speaking, depending on the country and the time, nobody said Jews couldn't farm or build things, etc. They simply didn't. In this 2004 study, researchers found that even in areas where Jews were not restricted at all in their choice of occupation or in their ability to own land, they still gravitated overwhelmingly to middleman-type jobs, including large presences in the money-lending industry. And of course, the same problem of the Sephardics and Mizrahis shows up again. In Middle Eastern countries under Muslim rule, the Jews became moneylenders just as they did in Christian lands. And the Muslim ban on usury was just as strong, if not stronger, than in Christian lands. In fact, many Middle Eastern countries today still have a ban on usury. So if it was this pressure to move into the financial industry that made Jews smarter, again, why do the Mizrahi lag behind? Also, there's a fundamental flaw in the argument. Who's to say that a life in finance even makes you more intelligent? Or is every bull on Wall Street just necessarily a genius? The work of a moneylender can easily be done by somebody who is merely competent. Especially when there is only severely hampered competition from non-Jews, you don't need to be a genius. And money tended to be strongly inherited in the Middle Ages, especially among the Jews who lived in extremely insular communities. Just as it is today, success in business comes from having connections and access to capital, not from any special ability. All of this combined suggests that to be a moneylender at this time did not require any special knack for numbers. Sure, the Jews might have been competent with numbers, but then again, most people are. If the basic premise of this theory is true, that Jews being involved in this line of work could affect their genetics to such a large degree, then all it really suggests is that they might pass on a middling competency with numbers and their motivation to make lots of money. In short, the Jews became moneylenders not because it was the only job available to them, but because it was the highest paying job available to them and there was very little competition around. In this environment, I don't suspect that a special knack for numbers would be required. And lastly, I want to work in here a point about the nature of IQ generally. The idea that general intelligence even follows a normal distribution is nothing more than a guess. Things like SAT scores, Stanford reading tests, and all other tests of intelligence have been shown to be significantly non-normal. Note, however, that I just used the term general intelligence rather than IQ, because while IQ itself does follow a normal distribution, it's a little known fact that it only does so because it's made to. I won't bother getting into the math for how this works, but just know that for any test of aptitude, even though the results might or might not be distributed normally, a normal distribution of rankings can be generated for those results. And this is exactly what IQ does. I want to make clear that I am in no way disregarding the usefulness of IQ as a measurement. In fact, I think it's quite important. I only bring this up to point out that simple comparisons of the IQ curves of two groups cannot be used as a means to show that one group should be expected to have more geniuses than another. Let me explain why. General intelligence is distributed non-normally, with, at least among whites, a significantly longer right tail than left tail. A graph which looks like this, when translated into IQ rankings, would be made to fit a perfect normal curve. This means that it's possible for a group with a lower average IQ to have a higher proportion of geniuses than a group with a higher average IQ. To take the illustration to the extreme, imagine one group whose scores for general intelligence look like this. Now imagine another group with scores that look like this. We can see that by overlapping these graphs, the first group has a much higher proportion of geniuses than the second group. Yet when we transform these test scores into IQ rankings and compare the graphs again, we see that we can be misled into thinking that the second group would contain more geniuses. Now, I'm not insinuating that these two groups above represent whites and Jews respectively. I'm only showing that when comparing IQ scores, which represent only rankings and not raw scores of general intelligence, we can easily be misled as to the proportion of genius tier individuals within populations, and this is exactly the variable we are examining. But up to this point, we've only been discussing the IQ of Jewish people as a means to gauge their intelligence. Some will argue that there are many other examples of Jewish intelligence outside of their IQ, and they'll typically point to their success in a group to do so. For example,
it's so preposterous when you look at the actual number of European Jews versus the general population of the world, and the number of European Jews that have won Nobel Prizes. It's off the charts.
It is true that Jews are significantly overrepresented among Nobel laureates. As of just a few years ago, 21.5% of all winners were Jewish, despite Jews making up only 0.2% of the world's population, a 137 times overrepresentation. Now, a complete breakdown of the well-known Jewish bias within Nobel Prizes would take an entire video, but I will make a few points here. Number one, there's not even any reason to believe that higher IQ correlates with receiving more Nobel Prizes. In fact, if we accept the given IQ figures for the world, then East Asians are extremely underrepresented, which proves at the very least that the awarding of the prize is not based on intelligence alone. There have to be other factors at play. And number two, Nobel Prizes are awarded by committee. It's fair to say that in any given field in any given year, more than one research team could be said to qualify for the prize. This means that there is no hard reason as to why one team may be chosen over another, and other factors have to come into play in making the decision. And as we've seen, Jews tend to score exceptionally well in the verbal portion of IQ tests, and a mastery of language would be a very helpful resource in swaying a few votes your way. Although I suspect their moderate advantage in the use of language would not go far enough to explain the 137 times overrepresentation. Overall, I don't think we can really place much value on the Nobel Prizes anyways. Generally speaking, genius is not chosen by committee. But what about Jews in chess? 54% of world chess champions have had one or two Jewish parents. Obviously, this means they're pretty smart, right? Not at all necessarily. First and foremost, chess is a game of familiarity. It could perhaps be used as a metric of intelligence if we were to track how quickly one learns the game, but how good you are at the game isn't at all related to intelligence. And let's just make a few other points on the matter. Number one, many countries with lower average IQs do well at chess. Not surprisingly, these are the countries which prioritize children learning chess and who take pride in their chess champions. In a similar vein, Nigeria, which has a fairly low average IQ, tends to produce far more high-level Scrabble players than their IQ alone would suggest, and Scrabble is certainly thought of as a game of intellect. It turns out that basically what makes you good at Scrabble is playing Scrabble, and the same goes for chess. Number two, take a look at this 2007 study, which shows no correlation found, and possibly even a negative correlation between general intelligence and chess ability. And number three, to top it all off, the best chess player in the world is actually a computer, which as a programmer, I would argue has an IQ of 0. So at this point in my research, it seems that there were no reliable studies which actually pointed to an average Jewish IQ of 115, and all the explanations seem to fall flat. And while we're at it, here is a lightning round of a bunch of other problems with the theory. There are higher average IQ subgroups than Jews in the US. Episcopalians, for example, have been found to have a higher average IQ than American Jews. As of 2020, according to Wikipedia, they have about 1.6 million members as compared to the Jews' 7.6 million in the US, or about a fifth. Assuming all else to be equal, we would expect Episcopalians to represent about a fifth or more of Joe Rogan's political guests on his podcast. But of course, the reality is nowhere near that. Number 2, remember that as stated above, U.S. whites are largely descended from Western Europeans. And as such, we would expect them to have IQs higher than 100, which turns out to be the case. U.S. whites have been shown to have an average IQ of 104, which, if we're using the same 145 IQ figure as before, puts the number of expected white geniuses at 719,200. And if you were to include only white Americans of Western European descent, the number might be even higher. Number 3, did you notice that people arguing this point always use the high-end estimate of 115 for Jewish IQ?
Ashkenazi Jews have an average IQ of 115.
Even though the consensus is that it ranges anywhere from 107 to 115. It's because they know if they use the low-end estimate, the expected number of Jewish geniuses above 145 IQ drops to a fairly insignificant 42,560, which is only about 5% of the genius tier individuals as with whites. And this isn't even including any other high IQ populations in the US. Number 4, Ashkenazi Jews have anywhere from 30 to 50% European DNA, which you can see in person in their sometimes blue eyes and light hair. Would we reasonably expect a Semitic group with IQs probably in the mid-90s range, when mixing with Western Europeans who have IQs of around, let's say, 100 to 105, to produce descendants with IQs in the 107 to 115 range? Studies have shown time and again that IQ tends to be strongly inherited. So while this method may seem overly simplistic, we can with some certainty use this reasoning to say that this outcome is unexpected. And one last thing while I'm at it. In many studies, it's true, Jews score very well on the verbal portion of the exam. Let's just assume that all of the numbers are fair. Even if they excel in linguistics, I put it to you that this is largely useless in terms of real problem solving. Engineering, physics, the building of modern civilization, skills which involve solving real problems are unaffected by one's lexical acumen. Their IQ scores, mediocre though they are only being bolstered by a domain which we ought not to value as highly as others. And there's one last point to discuss which can probably disprove the claim altogether just by itself. It involves Israel's IQ and basic math. You see, Israel as a nation has an IQ of around 94, according to the website World Data. But of course, the country's population isn't made up entirely of Ashkenazi Jews. Here is the breakdown of each major racial group within Israel. As you can see, with an Ashkenazi population of 2.8 to 3.1 million and a total population of 9.2 million, they make up about 33.6% of the country's population. Now, if we take the known IQ figures for all other ethnic groups living in Israel, we can figure out Ashkenazi expected IQ pretty easily. If we use the high-end estimate of 115, we see that Israel would have an expected IQ of 98.35, much higher than the 94 we see today. Even when using the low-end estimate of 107, the IQ is still much too high at 95.66. Only when we reduce the Ashkenazi IQ to 103 do we get the expected result of 94. So even with generously low estimate for Sephardic and Mizrahi IQ scores, and a higher-end estimate for Israel's average IQ, the highest score we would expect Ashkenazi Jews to have on average is 103. And this conclusion seems to mesh pretty well with one research paper from Lynn, which found that Israeli Jews of Oriental origin had IQs around 14 points lower than Ashkenazi Jews. Now, some of you might want to point out that these are Israeli Ashkenazis rather than the American Ashkenazis the video is ostensibly about. And I suppose that's a fine point to make, as long as you're willing to accept that moving to Israel somehow drops your IQ by a standard deviation. The fact of the matter is that in regard to the argument of Ashkenazis possessing a genetic advantage to intelligence, the bunk numbers for Israeli Ashkenazis completely disprove the possibility. And lastly, I think it's only fair that we ask ourselves, is it possible that these studies were all just faked? We've already examined how a healthy proportion of the most commonly cited works on the matter use non-representative groups to make their arguments. What if other commonly abused statistical methods were employed to skew the data? Easier testing, giving answers beforehand, or simple fabrication of data. Many people today are aware of what is called the reproducibility crisis in science, a phenomenon which no doubt has, at least in part, been caused by dishonest data manipulation. Why could not the same skepticism which we have towards statistic at large be applied to these scientific studies? Even among the IQ tests of other countries, we know that there's foul play going on. Most notoriously among the Chinese, who claim an average IQ of 105 to 109 for their country. Despite these being the generally accepted numbers in the mainstream, it's very commonplace to see people call these numbers out as fake, and yet they receive no accusations of anti-Chinese racism. Yet to imply that similar cheats have been employed in bolstering Ashkenazi IQ figures is deemed anti-Semitic. Not because it's actually racist, not because Jews really care about being called low IQ, but because it is their last standing defense against accusations of overrepresentation. But what if the claims are still true? Some of you, even after hearing all that I've had to say in this video, will stubbornly choose to continue believing the narrative of the intellectual superiority of Ashkenazi Jews. All I request of you is that you ask yourself this one question. Even if Jews truly are smarter, they have more geniuses than everybody else, etc., etc., is it still good that they should be so overrepresented? To say that is to say that any racial group who happens to score lower on an IQ test should necessarily have less of a say in how the country is governed. Sure, dummies will always have their one vote, but if you have outsized power in the media, your ideas will reach millions of times more people, which is bound to change opinions and electoral outcomes. If you believe in democracy for some reason, this is clearly anti-democratic, as some voices have infinitely more power than others in a system in which we're all supposed to be equal. We would also need to be making the assumption that all Jewish people have the best interests of the country in mind. And I don't think it's unfair to say that many would reasonably put the interests of their own people above a country full of people they are unrelated to. And I'm not saying this is wrong. Jews have the right to feel more connected to their own people than to a country full of strangers. I'm just saying it's dumb for us not to recognize this. We could continue down this line of thinking too. If the Jews are smarter than anybody else, and their being overrepresented in positions of power and influence is good for a country, then why shouldn't we have Jews move to countries where their numbers are small and have them take over positions of power there? Jews in China, Jews all across Africa, being fractions of the population, yet representing half of the guests on important political platforms. By the logic you accept, this would be the best course of action for the world. They are the smartest, and you tacitly accept that they have all of our best interests at heart. But of course, even you people can see the obvious problem here. The Chinese would not accept this state of affairs, nor Africans, nor Indians, because they don't want a different group of people coming in and taking the wheel of their ships of state. Why then should not the same thinking apply to America? Or if you believe in the liberal fantasy of the American, quote, melting pot, that America was supposed to accept the, quote, tired and poor, apply this thinking to Europe, where the same problem persists and where the natives are Europeans. Even if you choose to accept the absurd, pseudoscientific fantasy notion that Ashkenazis have a higher than average IQ as compared to every other racial group, it is still not a good thing, nor even benign, that they should be so overrepresented in any system, democratic or otherwise. So in conclusion, for the claims of high Jewish IQ, since they lack any sound basis in research, since they are supported using arguments which are at best unfalsifiable and at worst verifiable nonsense, since we know a more reasonable estimate of their IQ would mean that their number of geniuses is dwarfed by the number of white geniuses, I am unapologetically and unambiguously saying that this claim is bunk. That it has only been propagated using a myriad of dishonest statistical techniques and pseudoscientific explanations, and I will speculate now, has only gained prominence as a conjured together ex post facto explanation for their high levels of overrepresentation. Overrepresentation among billionaires. Overrepresentation on all Forbes' wealthiest lists. Overrepresentation among Harvard and Yale undergrads. And overrepresentation among the 40 richest individuals in the US. The only reason people continue to make this claim of extraordinary Jewish intelligence is because it is a benign way to escape confronting the question of Jewish overrepresentation. Once an honest person realizes and engages with this problem, you need an explanation. Your soul yearns for the truth. Now, most grifters are wise enough to avoid the landmine altogether and remain willfully ignorant. But for those who step on it, like Jordan Peterson, the only way to avoid the blowup is to diffuse the whole situation with this one ready-made explanation. If the Jews are simply smarter, then everything's okay, and we should just allow them to wield political power far beyond the scope of their numbers. Problem solved. And I say all of this is nonsense. We should no longer allow ourselves to be browbeaten by this false sense of inferiority. Nor should we be made to accept what is obviously an astroturfed media landscape as soon as a few bunk scientific papers are waved in our faces.